There were 100 fighter planes on a Curtiss assembly line in the winter of 1941, and the British would not take them. Britain was fighting alone. Britain was losing. Britain needed every airplane on the face of the earth, and Britain looked at these 100 and said no. Give them to China. Give us the next model instead. They arrived in Rangoon in wooden crates, with no guns in them. No radios, no gun sights. Somebody was going to have to go out and buy those separately from the Colt Company, from RCA, from the United States Army. Those 100 rejected airplanes and the men who flew them would become the only Allied air unit in Asia that the Japanese Empire could not sweep away. The man who led them was 48 years old. He was partly deaf. He smoked 3 packs of unfiltered Camels a day. And 4 years earlier, the United States Army Air Corps had invited him to retire because he would not stop being right. 1937. Claire Lee Chenault was 43 years old, though he told everyone he was 46. He had been adding 3 years to his age since he was a young man, and he never explained why. The deafness was the common wound of his generation of pilots. The price of a decade in open cockpits with an engine roaring 6 feet in front of your face and nothing between your ears and the noise. He flew on a medical waiver. He had logged more than 1,300 hours that way, and he had a habit no air force in the world has ever rewarded. He argued with his superiors. The argument was about one question, and in the 1930s, it was the most important question in military aviation. Can bombers be stopped? The answer in every room that mattered was no. In Italy, General Giulio Douhet had written that bomber formations could reach any city on Earth, and that fighters would be useless against heavily armed bombers flying in formation. His ideas became required reading at the United States Army Air Corps Tactical School. At that school, a tight-knit group of officers built an entire doctrine on it. They became known as the Bomber Mafia. Speed, altitude, range, heavy armament, tight formations. Put enough guns on a bomber, fly it high enough and fast enough, and nothing on Earth can touch it. The proof was sitting on the ramp. Boeing's new YB-17 flew faster and higher than the Army's own frontline fighters, and it bristled with machine guns. No anti-aircraft shell can reach it, they said. No pursuit plane can catch it. Fighter escorts would be unnecessary. And besides, no pursuit plane had the speed or the range to escort a bomber anyway. In 1931, the Army ran war games to test it. The pursuit planes could not catch a single bomber. The argument was settled. Chenault would not stop making it. He had come up the hard way. Born in Commerce, Texas, on September 6, 1893. Raised in Waterproof, Louisiana, a farming town in the Mississippi Delta. One-room schoolhouse. He described himself later as something of a loner. At 17, he was the teacher and the principal of a country school outside Shreveport. He married Nellie Thompson on Christmas Day, 1911, and left teaching to find work that would feed a family. He was working in a tire factory when America entered the First World War. He quit, joined the Army, made first lieutenant, and got himself assigned to Kelly Field in San Antonio as a drill instructor, because Kelly Field was where the Army taught men to fly. A civilian instructor washed him out of the aviation program. Private lessons had taught him bad habits. He got a second check ride with a military pilot, and got himself reinstated, and he earned his wings in April 1919. He turned out to be a superb pilot. By 1930, he was a captain and the head of the pursuit section at the tactical school. He was teaching in the birthplace of the doctrine he did not believe. There was a captain there named Clayton Bissell, a World War I ace. A true believer in the bomber. They disagreed. Remember that name. That argument is going to follow both of these men for 15 years, across 2 continents, and it is going to end this story. The commander of the school asked Chennault to build an exhibition team. 3 men, 3 Boeing P-12 biplanes, tied together in formations nobody had flown before. At the team's final performance in late 1935, 2 men in the crowd were watching. One was William Pawley, who sold Curtiss aircraft in China. The other was Mo Pangsu, a senior officer in the Chinese Air Force. Mo offered to hire all 3 pilots as flight instructors in China. Chennault's 2 teammates took the offer and left. Chennault said no. He was still going to win the argument at home. He did not win it. What he got was a reputation. Difficult. Competent, but he argues too much. They promoted him to major and sent him to the 20th Pursuit Group as executive officer, which is where the Army puts a man it does not know what to do with. The flight surgeons grounded him. Then they put him in the hospital. Then the Army invited him to retire. He did. He and Nellie had a farm near Waterproof. She was content there. He was not. He had been quietly negotiating with the Chinese. 3 months, study and analyze the Chinese Air Force. The pay was far above what the Army had ever given him. The day after he retired from the United States Army, Claire Chennault boarded a ship in San Francisco, bound for China. The ship docked overnight at Kobe, on the Japanese home island. Chennault and a companion went ashore and spent the evening quietly looking at Japanese civil defense measures. He was 43 years old, unemployed by his own country, and he had already started spying on the enemy that nobody in Washington believed was an enemy. Halfway around the world, a boy was growing up under Texas sky who would one day fly Chennault's tactics into a gorge a mile deep and save a country. David Lee Hill was born on July 13, 1915, on the Korean Peninsula. His father was a Presbyterian missionary. He was the youngest child, and he was only a year and a half old when his father's health broke, and the family came home to Virginia. He remembered nothing of Korea. They went to Louisville, and then, in 1921, to San Antonio, where Dr. Sam Hill was called to a big old church and built it into the largest Presbyterian congregation in the Southern Assembly. The boy they called Tex learned to hunt and fish from his father. In the Texas Hill Country in the 1920s, when living outdoors meant a bedroll and a fire, and getting up at daylight with your father cooking breakfast. A Korean man lived with the Hills in San Antonio and taught the boy to make kites. Fancy ones. Nothing you ever saw in Texas. That was the start of it. Then the cadets from Kelly Field started coming around because Tex Hill had a good-looking sister and a good-looking cousin, and those young men wore helmets and goggles. Hill and a friend named Chess Schroeder took the money out of the collection plate on a Sunday morning, slipped out of church, and rode out to a field near Stinson. They paid a man $1 for a ride around the Patten in a Travel Air. He remembered the thrill, and then he remembered starting to worry about his conscience. because he had spent his Sunday collection money on an airplane ride. He heard his father talk about the Far East. He wanted to go back. Military school at Sandona. Then McCallie, near Chattanooga, where his pranks earned him restrictions. He graduated at 17 and wanted the Navy. His father wanted college. He graduated from Austin College in 1938. He had tried the Army Air Corps first. They turned him down. He never found out why. He guessed his eyes, maybe. He never knew. So he took the exam for the Navy and rode a motorcycle down to Opelika, Florida, through rain in Louisiana, so hard he could barely see through his goggles. 110 men tried out. 12 went on to Pensacola. He was one of them. He rode the motorcycle back and sold it. The first, 61, a knucklehead. He regretted it for the rest of his life. 13 months of the best flight training in the world, 55 hours of aerobatics and gunnery, seaplanes on floats, steermans, instruments, fighters. When you came out of Pensacola, you were ready for the fleet. He went to the Saratoga flying TBDs, then to the East Coast and the Ranger, flying SB-2U dive bombers out of Bermuda, escorting the convoys forming up for the run to Britain. He was in the war before America was in the war. He just did not know it yet. He had put in for a transfer to the heavy cruiser, Houston, because the Houston was in the Far East, and the Far East was where he had been trying to get back to his whole life. The transfer did not go through. On the night of February 28th, 1942, the Houston went into the Sunda Strait between Java and Sumatra alongside the Australian cruiser Perth and ran headlong into a Japanese invasion force. Both ships were sunk. Of roughly 1,100 men aboard the Houston, 368 survived to be taken prisoner. Tex Hill had asked to be on that ship. While Hill was flying dive bombers over the Atlantic, Chennault was in China, watching an Air Force die. He landed in Shanghai in June of 1937. 3 weeks later, on July 7th, Japanese troops stormed the Marco Polo Bridge outside Beijing, and the largest land war in Asian history began. Chennault offered his services immediately. They sent him to Nanchang to train fighter pilots for a war that had already started. On July 23rd, he sent his report to the Generalissimo. It was not a report anyone wanted. The Chinese Air Force had 100 obsolete Curtiss Hawk biplanes, 21 bombers, Italian and German and American, 10 Boeing P-46 fighters. Its pilots were poorly trained, barely able to handle docile trainers, he wrote. Much less frontline fighters. That was the Air Force he had been hired to build a war around. The woman who hired him was Madame Chiang Kai-shek, raised in the United States, educated at Wellesley. In 1936, she had taken over as Secretary General of the Chinese Commission on Aeronautical Affairs, and she was the one who had reached across the Pacific for a retired American captain nobody else wanted. The first big mission was a disaster. The Japanese cruiser Izumo was anchored at Shanghai, shelling the city. The Chinese Air Force was ordered to silence her guns. The bombardiers failed to adjust for their release, and most of the bombs came down on Shanghai. 3,000 civilians died. But the fighter pilots Chennault was training had a different day. 18 Japanese bombers came up from Taiwan, and the Chinese jumped them over Hangzhou and killed 3 and lost nothing. The next day, 16 more came at Nanking unescorted, and the Chinese shot down 4 and damaged 6. That same day, the carrier Kaga sent 12 biplane bombers to Hangzhou. One came back. So Chennault built the thing that would matter more than any airplane he ever flew. Assigned to set up the air defense of Nanking, he put spotters at locations all around the city. They reported by Army field telephone into a map room in the city stadium, where men plotted incoming aircraft with markers on a table. He put a radio in every flight leader's airplane, so the plotters could vector the fighters onto the bombers before the bombers arrived. No radar, telephones, a map, and men who could hear. Shanghai and Hangzhou copied it. When Japanese bombers and their escorts took the daylight away, Chennault moved his people to dawn and dusk. He trained his bomber crews by laying out patterns of lights on the runways in the shape of Japanese ships. When they went in for real, the Japanese searchlights and muzzle flashes did the same job the practice lights had done, and guided the bombers in. He flew those missions himself, not as a leader, as an observer, in a Curtiss Hawk, watching how the Japanese fought so he could write it down. Shanghai fell in November. Nanking fell on December 13th. What the Japanese army did in Nanking over the next 6 weeks does not need embellishment and will not get any here. Hundreds of thousands of civilians and disarmed soldiers were murdered. Between 20,000 and 80,000 women were raped. Chennault kept writing his reports. By the autumn of 1940, the Japanese were bombing Chinese cities daily. Nearly 100 bombers hit Chongqing alone every day. Chongqing was out of range of Japanese fighters, so the bombers came unescorted, and Chennault's Chinese pilots shot down 9 of them and damaged 30 more. Then, the escorts arrived, fast, agile, 20mm cannon. In one day, they destroyed 13 Chinese fighters. Chennault studied it carefully. He wrote up what he saw in detail, and he sent it to Washington, the Mitsubishi A6M, the Zero. He told them it was far superior to anything the Chinese had. He told them it was equal or superior to America's own frontline fighters. Washington ignored him, not because the report was thin, because of what everyone in Washington already knew. The Japanese were not capable of designing and building a superior fighter aircraft. That was the common wisdom. It was said in the State Department, and it was said by senior commanders, and it was believed, and Chennault's dispatches went into a file drawer. Look at the shape of this. He had lost his career arguing that fighters could stop bombers. He was right. He had told Washington the Zero existed. He was right. He had built the early warning net that made all of it work, and no one in the American military wanted it. His first enemy was not Japan. It was the United States Army Air Corps. In October of 1940, the Generalissimo told him what he had to do. You must go to the United States. China's Air Force had been destroyed. It existed in name only. If China was going to stay in this war, China needed an Air Force instantly, and there was exactly one place on Earth to get one. Chennault went home and walked into the rooms where the decisions were made. General George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the United States Army, Hap Arnold, who ran the Air Corps, Admiral Towers, Secretary Stimson. They were all against it. Midsummer Night's Pipe Dreams, they called it. What Chennault asked for was 100 fighter pilots with 500 hours of pursuit experience. Hap Arnold told him what that would mean. If he gave Chennault that many pilots with that much experience, it would fold up his entire pursuit section. the whole thing. There would be nothing left. Chennault did not endear himself with his answer. "General," he said, "if you can't spare that many men with that kind of experience, you don't have a pursuit section to begin with." There was one way around the wall, and it was not a military one. A journalist named Joe Alsop, a man with access, arranged a meeting with the president. And Franklin Roosevelt listened to the thing the generals had refused to hear. The China lobby went to work. Madame Chiang's brother, TV. Sung, Harvard graduate, China's top man in Washington, well liked in the corridors that counted. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau. They arranged the money. And then came the airplanes. Not the ones they asked for. They wanted 500. They wanted B-17s, and Marshall said no. The fortresses go to England. What they got was 100 Curtiss P-40s. And here is why they got them. Britain had already bought them. Britain was fighting for its life, alone, and Britain looked at that airplane and did not want it. So Britain made a deal. Cut 100 off our line. Give them to China. Give us the next generation of the airplane instead. That is the only reason the American volunteer group ever existed. Chennault's 100 fighters were 100 airplanes the British had turned down. The first. 35 left York Harbor on the 19th of February, 1941, on a cargo ship down the Atlantic, around the Horn of Africa, across the Indian Ocean to Rangoon, 3 months. Each airplane came in 2 crates, one for the fuselage, one for the single-piece wing. They came off the factory floor without government-furnished equipment. No reflector gun sights, no radios, no wing guns. The Chinese had to buy them from Colt, from RCA, from the United States Army, piece by piece. Chennault's fighters arrived as pieces of fighters, and somebody had to go shopping for the rest. At Rangoon, mobs of Indian and Chinese laborers muscled the crates onto trucks by hand, opened them, muscled the wings and fuselages to the assembly area, towed them 10 miles to Mingaladon for final assembly, under open-air thatched shelters, because in the tropical sun, the metal became too hot to touch. 2 airplanes were lost before they ever left the docks. One was missing so many parts it would never fly. The other lost its wing crate into the harbor. When they opened it 2 days later, salt corrosion had eaten it. Both were pushed aside for spares. The first P-40 flew on June 12th to sell the airplane to the Chinese delegation. Chennault had taken them to Bolling Field outside Washington, where a young Army pilot named John Allison threw a P-40 around the sky. Remember Allison too? He comes back. The last thing Roosevelt authorized was the part the generals hated most. Chennault could recruit American pilots at ground of the Army, the Navy, and the Marines. They would resign their commissions. They would become civilians and go to work for a company called Camco, the Central Aircraft Manufacturing Company, a front William Pawley had set up. The contracts were masterpieces of ambiguity. $600 a month for a pilot, $675 for a flight leader, roughly $250 for a skilled mechanic, far above American military pay, and something that was not in the contract at all. Some pilots were told, verbally, that there was a rumor, a bounty, $500 for every enemy aircraft destroyed. Not a promise. A rumor. 60 of the pilots came from the Navy and the Marine Corps. 40 came from the Army Air Corps. American generals and admirals fought the recruiting the whole way. Chenault was nearly arrested at one naval base when he showed up looking for men. But he was carrying letters signed by the chiefs of staff. The recruiters told the prospects what they needed to hear. One of them found a 28-year-old Marine lieutenant and flight instructor at Pensacola named Gregory Boyington, a hard drinker and a brawler, qualities that would not endear him to Chenault. Another recruiter, a retired Navy commander named Rutledge Irvine, walked into a ready room in Norfolk, Virginia, and unrolled a big map and pointed at a country the men in that room could not have found. This is Burma. This is the Burma Road. It goes up into China. We're looking for volunteers to keep it open. He was honest about the rest. The contract was lucrative, and if you took it, the Navy gave you a complete discharge. No reserve status, nothing. You lost a year of service, and the Navy washed its hands of you. Tex Hill was 25 years old. 7 pilots off that carrier signed. Hill, Eddie Rector, Bert Christman. 100 pilots signed on. One man, Albert Baumler, was refused a passport because he had already flown as a mercenary in the Spanish Civil War. So 99 sailed. They were going to fly 100 airplanes the British had rejected under a Chinese flag for a private company led by a deaf man the United States Army had thrown. And the country they had just stopped serving was 4 months from Pearl Harbor. The first American volunteer group of the Chinese Air Force was created by order of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek on the 1st of August, 1941. The men came off the narrow-gauge railway from Rangoon at a place called Tungu, and what waited for them at Kedor Field was heat that pressed down like a hand, rain that fell in solid sheets for hours, insects in numbers that defied belief, and bamboo huts with cots that turned sleep into an act of endurance. The food was British. The cigarettes were British. The complaints were American, and there were a great many of them. Paul Frillman was the group chaplain. He listened to the griping in the mess and in the huts, and what he heard worried him. These were not raw recruits who could be shouted into line. They were grown men who had walked away from careers to be here, and they had been told things in San Francisco and Norfolk and Pensacola that bore no resemblance to a Burmese jungle. Frillman thought the group might come apart before it ever saw a Japanese airplane. He thought there might be a mutiny. Claire Chennault had been fighting an argument for 11 years and losing it, and now the argument had followed him halfway around the world and turned into something he could teach. He called it kindergarten. 60 hours of lectures. 60 hours of familiarization in the P-40. That was the curriculum, and the lectures were the part that mattered. Geography, because these men did not know where they were. Jungle survival, because some of them were going to need it. And tactics, because everything else was decoration. He stood in front of them with those deep-set eyes and that face like weathered stone, and he told them to forget everything the Army Air Corps had taught them about fighting. That was the first thing: not adjust, not refine, forget. Then he told them why. The Japanese airplanes turn faster than your P-40, not slightly faster. Faster in a way that means if you enter a turning fight, you will lose it, and you will not get a second chance to learn the lesson. So do not turn with them. Ever. Come down out of the sun, from above, into their formation. Fire. Keep going. Scatter them, confuse them, pick them off one at a time as they come apart. 2 plane formations against fighters for maneuverability and mutual protection, 3 plane flights against bombers for concentrated firepower. These were the tactics the Royal Air Force had proven over Britain in the only air battle anyone had yet won against a modern enemy. And then he told them the thing that nobody in Washington wanted to hear. The Japanese pilots are well trained. They are disciplined. They know how to fly, and they know how to shoot. He had a captured Japanese training manual, and he had read it, and he told his men exactly what the enemy would try to do to them, because he had watched the enemy do it for 4 years from the cockpit of a Curtiss Hawk. Some of the men in that room had been recruited with a different story. Some had been told the Japanese were poor pilots in second-rate airplanes. A few had signed on believing that fighting the Japanese would be safer than fighting the Germans. They were listening to a man tell them that everything they had been sold was false, and that the only thing standing between them and the ground was a set of rules that felt, to a fighter pilot, like cowardice. Dive, shoot, run, do not stay and fight. What happened next did not look like the birth of a legend. November 3rd, 1941, would be remembered at Kedor as Circus Day. 2 P-40s ran off the end of the runway, one of them destroyed outright. 2 pilots taxied their airplanes into aircraft that were parked and not moving. Another pilot came in hot, stood on the brakes, and put his fighter up on its nose, while 2 mechanics were sitting on the wings. 7 airplanes damaged in a single day. 7, out of a group that had fewer than 100 and would never get more. 2 days later, Ed Conant cracked up another one. Conant was a veteran Navy flying boat pilot with almost no time in land planes, and it was his 3rd airplane in a week. The mechanics did the arithmetic and made the joke that was not entirely a joke. 2 more, and Conant would be a Japanese ace. Chenault wrote an angry letter to his recruiters in the States. Weed out the timid. Weed out the incompetent. 2 pilots were killed in training accidents in September. At the end of the month, 7 pilots and a crew chief quit and sailed for home. Hill and Rector reached Tungu on the 15th of September and went to the 2nd Squadron under Jack Newkirk, a Navy fighter pilot, off the carrier Yorktown. The first time Hill met Chenault, he could not stop looking at the man's face. Craggy, weathered, deep black eyes. "If you told me to go through that wall," Hill said, "I'd go." Then a pilot flipped through a magazine and found a photograph of a British P-40 in North Africa with a shark's mouth painted on the nose. He showed it around. The squadron asked Chenault if they could use it as a marking. Chenault said no. He said it should be the marking for the entire group. Within a week, every airplane on the field had teeth. One pilot looked at them and said it looked mean as hell. They painted squadron emblems too. 1st Squadron took a green apple with a uniformed Adam chasing a naked Eve and called themselves the Adam and Eves under Robert Sandy Sandell. 2nd Squadron painted a black and white panda, the symbol of China. 3rd Squadron, under Arvid Olsen, chose a red nude with wings and a halo and called themselves the Hells Angels. Every airplane also carried the insignia of the Chinese Air Force, a white star with 12 points. That was the flag they flew under, not the one they had grown up saluting. December 20th, 1941. Kunming. The warning came in and the P-40 went up, and what happened in the next 20 minutes was a victory won by men who ignored almost everything they had been taught. Jack Newkirk, leading the Panda Bears to the northwest, spotted 10 bombers below him with no fighter escort. Kawasaki Ki-48s out of Hanoi, the Allies called them Lilies. Fast, maneuverable, no armor, 3 machine guns. Newkirk brought his flight down out of the sun and opened fire. From far out of range, the bombers jettisoned their loads, turned, and ran. Newkirk led his Pandas back to Kunming. South of the city, the Adam and Eve's found the same formation. Sandel ordered 2 pilots to fly top cover. The rest attacked, and what followed was not a tactic. It was a mob. Fighters came at the bombers from every direction, cutting across each other, forgetting the hit-and-run passes, forgetting the 2-plane elements, forgetting everything Chenal had spent 4 months hammering into them. The 2 pilots assigned to top cover watched for as long as they could stand it, and then they dove in and joined the brawl. The Japanese formation was a diamond of 4, with a V of 3 on each flank. The right-hand V went first, hit by a mass of P-40s all at once, and all 3 Lilies went down. Eddie Rector ran out of fuel on the way home and put his airplane into a field on its belly. The AVG claimed 4. Japanese records show 3 lost and 7 damaged, including some that crashed on landing at Hanoi. 14 airmen dead. 30% of their airplanes and 1/3 of their aircrew gone in a single raid. That Japanese unit never came back to Kunming. Chenal had told his pilots something before they ever fought. If you can destroy 1/4 of the bombers in a raid, the Japanese will stop coming. He was right. Kunming had been bombed for years. It had been a target, over and over, with nothing in the sky to stop it. Now the bombers had turned around, and the people came out into the streets, and the Americans who had broken every rule in the book were heroes. Chenal sat them down and listed everything they had done wrong, 1 item at a time. Next time, he said, get them all. But there was something else at Kunming that day, something the men in the cockpits barely thought about, and it was the reason any of it worked. The P-40 could not climb. That was its great weakness, and there was no fixing it. It needed altitude to fight, 18 to 20,000 feet, and it needed time to get there. Radar would have given them that time. There was no radar in China. What China had instead was people. In every village across the provinces where the AVG operated, there was a man with a radio. Most of them keyed in Morse. When the group moved into a new base, they would take a map, put the base at the center, and draw concentric circles outward, 300 kilometers, in every direction. And then they waited for the villages to talk. A man in a village would hear engine noise, not see, hear, he would key it in. Somebody at the base would push a flag into the map on that village. Another village reported, and another flag went in. And then, slowly, the flags began to line up. You could watch it happen on the table. A line of pins forming across 400 miles of China. And the line had a direction, and the direction had a destination. When it crossed the 150-kilometer circle, the fighters launched. That was the arithmetic. 150 kilometers bought exactly enough time for a heavy fighter with a poor rate of climb to reach 20,000 feet and be waiting. And when the bombers arrived, the Americans were already above them, sitting in the sun. The system did something else too. Getting lost over China was easy. There were no maps worth the paper. If a pilot came out of a fight scattered and disoriented, He would find the first village he could, come down low over it, and fire a short burst. That information went straight to the base. He did not know where he was. But the base knew exactly where that village was, and when they gave him a heading, he could fly it home. Real simple, Tex Hill said. But by God, it was effective. Thousands of Chinese villagers. No names recorded, no decorations. Men who heard an engine and reached for a telegraph key, while their own cities burned. Without them, Chennault's tactics were a lecture in a bamboo hut. December 23rd, 1941, Rangoon. The Japanese Army Air Force came for the city with 60 Ki-21 heavy bombers out of Bangkok and Phnom Penh. The Allies called them Sallies, more than a ton of bombs each, a crew of 5 to 7. They had been used to great effect in China, in Malaya, in the Philippines. They came without fighter escort. 15 of them were headed for the airfield at Mingaladon, where Olson's Hells Angels were the entire American fighter force. The plan was to join with light bombers and Ki-27 fighters, all of it converging over Thailand into one enormous formation. The timing came apart. The attack arrived over Rangoon in 3 separate waves. About a dozen P-40s went up. The Sallies came first, tight, in Vs. RAF Buffaloes damaged one before the Americans got into it, and then it was a melee. 2 P-40s went down. Paul Green got out and lived. 5 Sallies fell. A third of the formation, 30 Japanese crewmen dead. South of the city, over the refinery at Syrium, 6 Hells Angels found 18 more Sallies in tight formation. Neil Martin led a 3-plane flight into them, flew into a wall of machine gun fire from the bomber's gunners, and went down burning. 2 of those Sallies were shot down. A third group, 27 bombers, reached Rangoon and hit it. More than 1,000 people died on the ground that day. Almost all of them civilians. By nightfall, the Japanese had lost 7 bombers with many more shot up. The Japanese pilots and gunners came home and claimed 43 Allied fighters destroyed. The RAF had lost 5 Buffaloes with their pilots. The AVG had lost 3 airplanes and 2 men. Christmas Day. The Japanese came back with 63 bombers and 25 fighters, 88 aircraft. At Mingaladon, there were 12 P-40s and 14 Buffaloes ready to fly. 2 replacement pilots had arrived from Kaidor on Christmas Eve with a truckload of ammunition. That was the reinforcement. Again, the Japanese battle plan came apart, splitting them into 3 groups. Over Syrium, 20 Sallies, escorted by 15 Hayabusas, were already turning for home after bombing the city. The Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa was the airplane the Allies called Oscar, and it would shoot down more Allied aircraft than any other Japanese fighter of the war. Most of Japan's aces flew them. 7 P-40s went into 35 airplanes, 7 against 35. They claimed 12 bombers and 3 fighters, and they identified the fighters as Zeros, which they were not. 2 P-40s crash-landed. Both pilots walked away. North of the city, the rest of the AVG and the RAF hit a much larger mass of bombers and fighters. Parker Dupuy was leading a flight of 3 and Dove on a Hayabusa, and he came down on it so fast he was going to ram it. He rolled hard. His wingtip went through the Oscar's wing and cut it off at the root. The Oscar spun away. Dupuy flew home with 4 feet missing from his own wing and landed it. The Allies claimed 28 Japanese aircraft destroyed on Christmas Day. Japanese records put it at about half that and the Japanese pilots and gunners who had attacked Rangoon came home and claimed 38 Allied fighters shot down. Sit with that number for a moment. 38. There were 26 Allied fighters in the air that day. Total, every P-40 and every Buffalo that Rangoon possessed. The Japanese claimed to have shot down half again more airplanes than existed. The actual Allied loss was 2 P-40s and 5 Buffaloes. This is not a story about Japanese dishonesty. The Americans did it too, and Rangoon proves it, over and over, for the entire life of the group. When several pilots fire on the same airplane and it falls, each of them watches it fall, and each of them is certain. The excitement, the panic, the adrenaline, the noise, 2-second glimpses through a gun sight while somebody is shooting at you from behind. Every man tells the truth as he saw it, and the numbers still come out wrong. Which means the great arithmetic of the Flying Tigers, the ratio that made them famous, the numbers on the recruiting posters and in the magazines, Kate. Not lies, claims. Remember that. It will matter later. 6 days after Christmas, on the last day of 1941, Brigadier General John Magruder sent a cable to Washington. The AVG had now fought 3 battles against a numerically superior enemy in 3 weeks. Kunming, the 23rd. Christmas Day. They had turned back every raid. They had blooded a Japanese Air Force that was, at that exact moment, sweeping every other Allied unit in Asia off the map. Magruder recommended that the group be absorbed into the United States Army as the 23rd Fighter Group. And then he explained why. Unless it was completely reorganized with Army officers, Army enlisted men, and Army logistics, the American Volunteer Group could have little military value. The only Allied air unit in Asia that was not losing. And here is the part that stings. Washington had already decided. The order authorizing the induction of the Flying Tigers into the United States Army Air Forces had come down on the 30th of December. The day before Magruder's cable, 10 days after their first combat. The recommendation was not a recommendation. It was paperwork catching up to a decision that had already been made. The men at Mingaladon did not know any of that existed. Newkirk's Panda Bears, Tex Hill among them, reached Rangoon by New Year's Day. And then the sky went quiet. The Japanese were standing down, licking their wounds, and Newkirk could not stand it. He decided to go to them. The target was a small field about 50 miles inside Thailand, near a village called Tak. 4 pandas took off from Mingaladon before dawn on January 3rd. Newkirk led, with Bert Christman on his wing. Hill flew on Jim Howard's wing. Christman's engine went sour. He turned back. 3 of them went in at sunup, in string, down the length of the field, and there were 9 Nate fighters sitting there in a row. Sitting ducks is what it looked like. What it actually was 9 fighters that had just landed from their own pre-dawn mission, which meant there were others still in the air. And nobody in the American formation knew that. Newkirk slid in between Hill and Howard. Hill came down behind a Nate at a range he would remember for the rest of his life. Less than 50 yards. He had a ring and bead sight, and he did not bother using it. Every 5th round was an incendiary, and the tracer came out of his guns, and it looked like water out of a hose. And it went into the airplane in front of him, and the airplane blew up. The same instant, a Nate he never saw made an overhead pass, and put 33 holes in his P-40. He never saw him. Hill pulled off the target, and there was another one coming at him head-on. They fired at each other. The Nate carried two 7.7mm guns, about the equivalent of a .30 caliber, and its bullets went into Hill's propeller and stuck there. And the prop went out of balance and started shaking the airplane apart. He throttled back and got down low. They were scattered now, separated. Hill came back to Rangoon alone. Jim Howard came in. Newkirk came in with two claimed. Howard had gotten some on the ground, and he had not even noticed the fighter that got on his tail. Hill told him to go look at his airplane. Howard walked over and counted the bullet holes. The next morning, before dawn, the Japanese came back to Rangoon with Nates and bombers. They shot down 3 Panda Bears. All 3 pilots lived. But it was the first clear Japanese victory over the American volunteer group, and it set the pattern for the rest of the winter. The P-40s raided Thai airfields by daylight. The Japanese hit Mingaladon before dawn, and the arithmetic began to grind. There were no spare parts. There was no depot closer than Kunming, 900 miles away. Every airplane that came home, shot up, came home to mechanics who had to fix it with what they could pull off airplanes that were already broken. Tires baked hard and brittle in the sun. Batteries went flat. Guns jammed because the solenoids were bad and there were no new solenoids. Second Squadron could put 10 fighters in the air. 10. Against raids that came in 50s and 60s. The Japanese noticed. General Sugawara Michio commanded the air forces in the region, and in Malaya and Singapore his bombers went where they wanted with almost nothing rising to meet them. Over Burma, his losses were staggering, and he had no appetite for more of it. He left a small force in Thailand and moved the rest of his fighters and bombers to other, less troublesome places. The AVG had done something no one else in Asia had done. They had made an enemy air force decide the price was too high. It did not matter, because on January 19th, 400 miles down the long, narrow tail of Burma, a small Japanese detachment walked onto the airfield at Tavoy and took it. And the next day, 35,000 Japanese soldiers came into Burma near Tak. They came over the mountains, on foot. The British had believed Burma was safe because the Royal Navy could stop an attack from the sea, and the mountain ranges would stop an attack over land. The mountains were the fortress wall, and everyone agreed no army could cross them. The Japanese 55th Division abandoned their trucks. They abandoned their pack horses. They put what they needed on their backs, and they walked across the wall. Waiting for them was the Burma Division. On paper, it had 18,000 men. Its actual fighting strength was 4,000 British and Indian troops. 4,000 against 35,000. Rangoon fell in March. And behind Rangoon, running north over the mountains, 717 miles of switchbacks and gorges and chain suspension bridges was the Burma Road. 200,000 forced laborers had built it by hand. It climbed through ranges 9,000 feet high and dropped into canyons 5,000 feet deep. It was the last thing connecting China to the outside world. Every rifle, every shell, every gallon of fuel, every spare part for every P-40 came up that road. The Japanese now held the port at the bottom of it, and they were walking north. On the 29th of March, 1942, Chenol was called to Chungking for a conference to decide the fate of his group. In the room were Chiang Kai-shek, Madam Chiang, Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell, commander of all American forces in the China-Burma-India theater, and a colonel who had arrived in the theater a few weeks earlier, Clayton Bissell, Hap Arnold's personal choice to command American air power in China. 15 years after the Air Corps Tactical School, the bomberman had followed Chennault to the far side of the world, and he had arrived holding the pen. Chennault was opposed to the induction. He said so. Chiang finally agreed to it, only after Stilwell promised that the fighter group would stay in China, with Chennault commanding it. Stilwell and Bissell wanted the AVG dissolved by the 30th of April. Chennault fought for July 4th, when the contracts expired. He got it. 2 months and 4 days. That is what he bought them. He was recalled to active duty on the 15th of April, 1942, and promoted to Brigadier General 8 days later. And here is the detail that tells you everything about the men running that theater. Chennault asked for one thing: 1 day's seniority over Bissell. 1 day. He was promised it. Bissell got the day. 1 day of rank, engineered on purpose, so that the man who had spent his career insisting fighters could not stop bombers would outrank the man who had just spent 7 months proving they could. May 7th, 1942. Rangoon was gone. Burma was gone. And a regiment of the Japanese 56th Division was driving up the Burma Road for Kunming. In front of them was one thing. The Salween cuts a gorge through western Yunnan, a mile deep. Sheer rock walls dropping away under the road. The water, a thread at the bottom. And one road clinging to the side of that canyon, carrying everything China had left. Behind the gorge lay Chungking. The fleeing Chinese had blown the bridge at the bottom of it, and the Japanese had started building a pontoon bridge to replace it. The column trailed from the river's edge to the top of the gorge and out onto the plateau beyond. Trucks, armor, thousands of men. The airplanes that went to meet them were not the tired old Tomahawks from Rangoon. They were P-40s, flown in from India, and the armorers had modified them by hand to carry Soviet-made bombs of 570 pounds. Tex Hill was 26 years old, and he had been a Navy dive bomber pilot in another life, which in that formation too made him the closest thing to an expert anyone had. 8 airplanes. Into a canyon a mile deep, against a division, they went in on the 5th and the 6th and the 7th, and they kept going in. The road down to the Salween descends 35 miles of switchbacks, and there was nowhere on it for a truck to hide. The gorge became a graveyard for military vehicles. The Japanese advance stopped. It never resumed. They did not cross the Salween, not that month, not that year. The drive that was going to take Kunming and knock China out of the war ended in that canyon, under 8 fighter planes. Chennault wrote afterward that the American volunteer group had staved off China's collapse on the Salween. Understand the arithmetic that was sitting in that gorge. 500,000 Japanese soldiers were tied down on the Chinese mainland. 500,000 men who would not have been needed there anymore. They could have gone south through the Philippines and Malaya and Singapore to Australia. They could have gone west across Burma to India. And, if India fell, the Japanese Empire touched the oil of the Middle East and reached its hand toward Germany. 8 airplanes. 2 months later, on the 4th of July, 1942, The American Volunteer Group was dissolved. Not by Japan, its people were offered commissions in the United States Army Air Forces. 5 pilots accepted. 5 out of the men who had spent 7 months proving the thing the Army had spent a decade refusing to believe. Many of them were disgruntled with Bissell, and they had reason to be. Because Bissell had tried something. He had tried to intimidate them into staying. He told them that if they walked, then as soon as they got home to the United States, they would be drafted into the Army. As privates, that was the pitch. That was how the United States Army Air Forces asked the only unit in Asia that was winning to please stay on. They walked. 18 of them went to fly transports for the China National Aviation Corporation. Others went home and took other jobs. Others rejoined the Navy, the Marines, the Army, and fought somewhere else. Gregory Boyington had already broken his contract that spring and gone home. He got back into the Marine Corps and took command of a squadron in the South Pacific. He would receive the Medal of Honor and survive a Japanese prison camp, and most of America would come to know his name and never know it started in a bamboo hut in Burma. Tex Hill stayed. He took a battlefield commission as a major. He commanded the 75th Fighter Squadron and later the 23rd Fighter Group. The Army Air Corps had turned him down flat when he was a college kid in Texas, and he never found out why. Now they wanted him badly. And John Allison came to fly for him. Allison was the man who had thrown a P-40 around the sky at Bolling Field in 1940, putting on a show to sell an airplane to a Chinese delegation. A salesman's prop, a demonstration. 2 years later, he was a major, commanding a squadron in China. Chennault got Allison's squadron transferred to Kunming by working around the chain of command, because he needed a 4th squadron, and the Army would not give him one. The circle closed on a runway outside Washington and reopened 4,000 miles away. Now, the numbers. You have heard them. The record is 297 enemy aircraft destroyed, 229 of them in the air, against 14 AVG pilots killed in action, captured, or disappeared. Those are claims, not lies. Claims. You watched it happen over Rangoon on Christmas Day, bird directions in the same afternoon. When the historian Daniel Ford went back and laid the AVG's claims against the surviving Japanese records, engagement by engagement, the number that came out was closer to 115. Ford's book came out in 1991, and the surviving Tigers were furious. He was accused of a hatchet job. He stood his ground, and his scholarship has held up, and here is the part that gets left out of the fight. Ford was not attacking them. His conclusion, in his own words, was that over Burma and China, they compiled a record without equal in the annals of aerial warfare, that they fought magnificently in a losing battle, that they gave America heroes at a time when America needed heroes as never before. The AVG stands taller in Ford's account than in the ones that just repeat the poster, because he told you what they were actually fighting with. Tires that had gone hard as stone, batteries with no charge in them, guns that would not fire because a 50-cent part had failed and there was not another one within 900 miles. Airplanes that were, in his phrase, virtually unflyable, and they kept taking them up. The achievement was never the number. Look at what was happening everywhere else in Asia in the first half of 1942. The Philippines, overrun, Bataan surrendered. Singapore, the greatest capitulation in British military history. Malaya, gone. The Dutch East Indies, gone. Burma, gone. The Houston, the cruiser Tex Hill, had asked to serve on the bottom of the Sunda Strait. Allied air forces across the entire theater were annihilated. Unit after unit after unit. The American volunteer group was not annihilated. For 7 months, outnumbered in nearly every engagement, flying an airplane the British had refused, with no spare parts and no depot and no reserve. They were the one Allied air unit in Asia the Japanese could not sweep away. And when everything else had already fallen, 8 of them went into a canyon and stopped a division. The doctrine worked. American pilots elsewhere flew the same airplane and lost almost all of them because they were fighting the way they had been taught at home. Turn with the enemy. Trust the airplane. Chennault's men refused to turn. They came down out of the sun, fired, and left, and they lived. Tactics went back to the War Department in writing, from the only man in Asia who was winning. Nothing was done with them. Hill believed it was because they were too simple. So simple that Washington could not accept that they meant anything. The same men who could not believe the Japanese could build a zero, could not believe an answer that plain. And underneath all of it, holding it up, were people whose names were never written down. Thousands of Chinese villagers with telegraph keys who heard an engine and reported it and put a flag on a map 400 miles away and told 8 American pilots where to be and when to be there. Separately and at a cost that is hard to put into words, Chinese civilians pulled downed American pilots out of the countryside and walked them home. The Japanese reprisals for that were cruel, and they were severe, and the Chinese did it anyway. Guerrillas who had been killing each other for a decade, nationalist and communist both, set it aside to get an American flyer to safety. Unless you came down right on top of the Japanese, Hill said, they'd get you out of there. Now the last thing, and it is the thing that gets left out of every telling, they were paid. $600 a month for a pilot, $675 for a flight leader, around $250 for a mechanic, and a rumor of $500 for every airplane destroyed. The Chinese government paid them. Some signed for the money, some signed because peacetime military duty had bored them out of their minds. Some signed because a recruiter told them. The Japanese were poor pilots in second-rate airplanes. Some signed because war with Germany was coming and they had done the math and decided the Japanese would be safer. 2 pilots died in training accidents before they ever saw an enemy. 7 quit in September. 3 more quit in the first week of December. Ed Conant wrecked 3 airplanes in a week. That is who they were. They were not saints, and they were not centurions. They were a couple hundred working men, most of them in their 20s, who took a paycheck to fly a cast-off airplane for a foreign government at the far edge of the world. And when the war came to them, they stood. That does not make the story smaller. That is the story. Because the men who hold the line are almost never the men in the paintings. They are men with mixed motives and bad tempers and binders and bar tabs who signed up for the wrong reasons and stayed for the right ones, and who found out what they were made of on a morning when there were 12 of them and 88 of the enemy. At Bolling Field in 1940, A Chinese official watched John Allison roll a 40 across the sky and said the thing everybody says, "We need 100 of these airplanes." Claire Chennault told him no. "You need 100 men like this." He was right about that too.